The complexities of global oil pricing. Introduction: From whale oil to the dawn of black gold. Welcome to a comprehensive exploration of the lifeblood of the modern global economy. We are going to take a deep, uninterrupted journey into the absolute complexities of global oil pricing, the devastating impact of geopolitical shocks, and the profound ways that governments attempt to intervene when the market spirals out of control. To truly grasp what is happening right now during the 2026 Iran war scenario, we have to understand the mechanics that govern the flow of energy. We have to understand how a barrel of crude oil is priced, how that price translates to the local petrol station, and how the entire system reacts when a major supply artery is suddenly severed. But to understand the present, we must first briefly anchor ourselves in the past. The timeline of global energy is a story of constant, relentless transformation. Long before crude oil dictated the pace of the global economy and triggered international conflicts, the world relied on entirely different sources for illumination and mechanical lubrication. Up until the middle of the 19th century, whale oil was the premium commodity used in lamps and early industrial machinery. It was incredibly expensive, inherently scarce, and dangerous to harvest. The entire trajectory of human development shifted dramatically in the year 1859. That was the year Edwin Drake successfully produced commercially usable quantities of crude oil from a relatively shallow 69-foot well in Pennsylvania. From that exact moment forward, petroleum was recognized as an exceptionally valuable and highly efficient commodity. Early markets saw this new, miraculous fuel finding ready buyers at prices ranging from 75 cents to $2 per gallon, an astronomical sum for the era. Following this initial discovery, the global price of crude oil remained remarkably consistent throughout the latter half of the 19th century and well into the early 20th century. The world industrialized at a breakneck pace. Entire national economies grew completely dependent on the steady, uninterrupted flow of cheap crude oil. But this era of calm, predictable pricing was never destined to last. As petroleum became the critical ingredient for transportation, agriculture, and military supremacy, it transformed from a simple commodity into the ultimate geopolitical weapon. The historical timeline of oil over the last century is defined by massive shocks, fierce government interventions, and highly complex economic recoveries. By tracing this timeline forward, strictly adhering to the chronological sequence of events, we can uncover the exact blueprint for understanding the catastrophic energy disruptions of the present day. Chapter 1: The 1970s Energy Crises and the Failure of Government Interventions. The modern era of extreme oil price volatility truly began in the 1970s. This period is absolutely critical to our understanding of energy markets because it offers the first major historical precedent for how governments attempt to intervene when the price of everyday fuel suddenly skyrockets beyond the reach of the average citizen. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out in the Middle East. In direct retaliation against nations that were providing diplomatic and military support to Israel, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries instituted a total and immediate oil embargo. They specifically targeted the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and several other allied nations. This was not merely a diplomatic protest. The embargo introduced immediate physical cuts in global oil production, slashing crude output by 5% every single month. At the time, the Middle East accounted for 36% of world oil production, and this sudden restriction left the global market short by roughly 4.5 million barrels of oil per day. The economic effects were instant and devastating. The global price of crude oil effectively quadrupled in the blink of an eye. It surged from roughly $3 per barrel to nearly $12 per barrel globally within a matter of months. This sudden, violent price shock acutely strained national economies that had spent the previous century growing entirely dependent on a limitless supply of cheap foreign oil. In the United States, drivers who had grown accustomed to paying about 38 cents for a gallon of petrol were suddenly faced with prices soaring well past 55 cents, representing an almost 45% increase at the retail pump. Faced with a sudden, paralyzing crisis that threatened to halt the entire economy, the United States government intervened aggressively. President Richard Nixon had already experimented with broad wage and price controls in the early 1970s, but the oil crisis demanded a specific legislative weapon. In November 1973, the government enacted the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act. This sweeping law was designed to directly control the price and the physical allocation of petroleum products across the nation. The government established a highly complex, two-tiered pricing system in an attempt to shield consumers from the global shock. Domestic oil produced from older wells that were drilled before 1973 was classified as old oil. This old oil was subjected to a strict, government-mandated price ceiling of $5.25 per barrel. Meanwhile, oil extracted from newer wells was classified as new oil and was legally allowed to sell for up to $11 per barrel. This historical precedent demonstrates exactly what happens when well-intentioned governments attempt to artificially cap the price of petrol to avoid extreme price hikes. The intervention completely and utterly distorted the fundamental mechanics of the free market. By artificially suppressing the price of gasoline by law, the government accidentally removed the primary financial incentive for domestic oil companies to explore for more oil and increase their production. Simultaneously, because the retail prices were kept artificially low for the consumer, there was absolutely no financial pressure or incentive for the general public to reduce their daily fuel consumption. Demand remained artificially high, while supply remained artificially low. The result was a textbook economic failure that is still studied in universities today. Price ceilings do not magically create more fuel, they simply create massive, immediate shortages. Independent gas stations quickly ran completely dry. Panicked motorists waited in lines that stretched for city blocks, often idling their engines and wasting fuel just for the chance to buy a few gallons. The frustration boiled over into physical violence, with fights routinely breaking out between desperate customers at the fuel pumps. Gas station owners were forced to hire armed security guards to protect their properties. Commercial truckers, unable to secure the diesel required to move the nation's freight, blocked interstate highways in massive protests, raising real fears that the entire national supply chain would simply shut down. Eventually, the federal government was forced to mandate strict civilian rationing. They implemented an odd-even gas buying system based on vehicle license plate numbers. Drivers with license plates ending in an even number were only legally permitted to purchase gas on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Drivers with odd-numbered plates were restricted to Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. No one was allowed to purchase fuel on Sundays. The primary lesson drawn from the 1970s energy crises is that price controls consistently fail to tame inflation, and instead, they trigger arbitrary rationing and severe reductions in product quality. As prominent economists noted during the crisis, the absolute surest way to create a severe shortage of any commodity is to pass a law dictating a maximum retail price. The painful but necessary economic truth is that the cure for high prices is high prices. When prices are allowed to rise naturally during a crisis, consumers are forced to conserve fuel and producers are highly incentivized to drill for more, ultimately bringing the market back into a natural equilibrium. While direct price caps proved disastrous in the 1970s, we can draw a direct line to how modern governments intervene today. Having learned that price ceilings cause physical fuel shortages, the strategy slowly evolved. By the time we reach the modern era, governments largely abandoned direct price controls in favor of massive financial subsidies. For example, during the global energy spikes following the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war, governments worldwide spent staggering amounts of money to shield their citizens from the true cost of energy. Global explicit subsidies for fossil fuels, which involve governments directly paying to reduce the cost of extraction or directly covering a portion of the retail price at the pump, surged to around $1.5 trillion in 2022. When including implicit subsidies, which account for undercharging for environmental costs, the total global support for fossil fuels reached a record $7 trillion. Roughly 80% of these explicit subsidies went directly to final consumers, effectively lowering the price at the pump without placing a legal ceiling on the commodity itself. While this modern method of intervention successfully avoids the physical gas lines and odd even rationing seen in the 1970s, it exacts a massive, often unsustainable toll on national budgets and actively undermines long-term global climate initiatives. The historical timeline shows us that while the specific mechanisms of government intervention evolve over the decades, the political desire to shield voting populations from the true, volatile cost of global energy remains a constant force. Chapter 2: The Economics of Price Recovery and the 1990s Gulf War. Moving forward on our strict chronological timeline, the world encountered its next massive energy shock in August of 1990. Following intense disputes over oil production quotas and war debts, Iraq suddenly launched a massive military invasion into neighboring Kuwait, triggering the First Gulf War. The geopolitical impact on the energy sector was immediate and severe. Crude oil supplies from both nations were abruptly taken offline by the conflict and subsequent international embargoes. The global market lost roughly 4.3 million barrels per day of combined crude oil production almost overnight. Consequently, global oil prices reacted with violent speed, doubling in just 3 months as they skyrocketed from $17 to $36 per barrel. This specific conflict is vital to our understanding of the industry because it introduces a critical question regarding the economics of price recovery. When a war inflicts catastrophic physical damage on a nation's energy infrastructure, do post-war oil prices remain artificially expensive to cover the massive costs of fixing that damage? The aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War provides the definitive historical answer to this question. The physical devastation inflicted upon Kuwait was truly unprecedented in the history of the petroleum industry. As the United States-led coalition forces pushed the Iraqi military out of the country, the retreating Iraqi forces engaged in a systematic campaign of environmental and economic sabotage. They intentionally detonated explosives at roughly half of Kuwait's oil wells, setting them ablaze and creating an apocalyptic landscape of fire and thick black smoke. The financial estimates of the destruction were staggering. Total infrastructure losses in Kuwait approached $100 billion when factoring in asset destruction, the loss of unrecoverable petroleum resources, and the complete loss of export revenue during the conflict. The specific, immediate cost, just to mobilize international firefighting teams, extinguish the raging well fires, and physically restore Kuwait's oil production facilities ranged between $8 and $10 billion. Despite these astronomical, unexpected reconstruction costs, the producing nations did not simply raise the global price of oil to pay for the damages. This is a common misconception about how the energy market works. Global crude oil is a globally traded, highly liquid commodity. The daily price is dictated by worldwide supply and worldwide demand, not by the specific financial burdens or reconstruction needs of an individual producing nation. While a nation like Iraq desperately desired higher prices to cover the massive debts incurred during their decade-long war with Iran and the subsequent Gulf War, they could not unilaterally force the global market to pay a reconstruction surcharge. If Kuwait or Iraq attempted to arbitrarily add a $10 premium to their oil to pay for their damaged infrastructure, global buyers would simply purchase their crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, or the North Sea instead. In fact, history shows us that crude oil prices actually decline quite rapidly once the immediate geopolitical terror subsides. Once the military crisis eased in early 1991 and global oil markets stabilized, prices began to fall. Over the 2 quarters, immediately following the peak of the Gulf War panic, global oil prices dropped by nearly 10%. This historical precedent illustrates how quickly energy markets can correct themselves once the immediate, existential threat to the physical supply chain is neutralized and fear leaves the trading floor. However, it is important to note that the physical destruction of infrastructure does remove spare capacity from the global system. This reduction in the global safety cushion naturally introduces a long-term risk premium into the baseline market. Therefore, while producers do not actively tack on a direct surcharge for war damage, the simple reality of tighter global supplies and damaged infrastructure keeps baseline prices slightly elevated compared to a world with perfect peace and perfect infrastructure. This era also birthed a highly critical economic theory regarding retail price recovery that affects every person who drives a car. Following the 1991 conflict, economists began to closely study exactly how retail petrol prices at the local gas station respond to the wild fluctuations of the global crude oil market. They identified a frustrating, asymmetrical phenomenon that defines the industry to this day. The theory, initially proposed by the economist Robert Bacon in 1991, is known in the industry as the rockets and feathers effect. This concept explains a painful reality for everyday consumers. When global crude oil prices spike due to a sudden geopolitical shock, like the invasion of Kuwait, the price of gasoline at the local retail pump shoots upward instantly, traveling fast and straight like a rocket. However, when the military crisis ends and global crude oil prices finally fall back down to normal levels, the retail price of gasoline does not drop immediately. Instead, it drifts downward incredibly slowly, floating down gently like a feather. In-depth economic data shows that this asymmetric price transmission is not an accident. It is highly calculated. A specific, non-responsive band exists in the retail fuel market. This means that the profit margin between the wholesale cost of crude oil and the retail price of finished gasoline must expand significantly before station owners will lower their prices. Statistical analysis demonstrates that this margin often has to expand by over 10% before retail prices adjust downward to actually benefit the fuel consumers. Conversely, the spread only needs to shrink by a minimal amount, roughly 5%, to trigger a swift and immediate price increase at the pump. During periods of sharp decline in the global crude market, such as the sudden drops seen in post-war environments, gasoline suppliers largely refrain from passing the wholesale cost reductions onto the public. Instead, they capture the difference to rapidly expand their own profit margins, essentially making up for lean times. This behavior is attributed to several factors, including local market monopolies, the high cost for consumers to drive around searching for cheaper gas, and careful inventory management by the retailers. The rockets and feathers mechanism ensures that while global crude oil might recover quickly after a war, the price you pay at the local pump rarely goes down as quickly as it went up. Chapter 3: The Mechanics of Petrol Pricing in the Modern Era, 2000 to 2025. As our timeline advances into the new millennium, the sheer mechanics of how oil is priced, traded, and sold become increasingly sophisticated, financialized, and volatile. The 25 years between 2000 and 2025 represent the most crucial era for understanding modern market behavior. This period was an absolute roller coaster. It includes the 2008 global financial crisis, which saw oil hit a staggering, inflation-adjusted record height of $145 per barrel. It includes the 2014 United States shale boom, a technological marvel of fracking that flooded the global market with massive new supplies of light sweet crude, crashing prices in the process. It encompasses the unprecedented 2020 COVID-19 pandemic crash, where plummeting global travel demand drove prices briefly below $20 a barrel and even into negative territory for certain futures contracts. Finally, it features the massive 2022 energy shock following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which radically reordered global energy flows. To truly comprehend how these massive, world-altering events translate to the everyday consumer, we must examine the precise, ground-level mechanics of local petrol pricing. A common and highly persistent point of confusion among consumers is why petrol is priced in near real time. If a geopolitical shock happens today, the price at the local station often goes up tomorrow. But the physical liquid currently sitting in the massive underground tanks beneath the gas station was purchased and delivered weeks ago at a much cheaper wholesale rate. Why is the consumer charged today's high price for yesterday's cheap gas? The answer to this mystery lies in a fundamental retail concept called replacement cost pricing. It helps to understand who actually owns the gas station. According to industry data, the vast majority of retail fuel stations are not owned by giant multinational oil corporations. They are independently owned and operated by small business franchisees. Less than 1% of convenience stores that sell gas are directly owned by big oil companies. These independent retailers operate on razor-thin profit margins when it comes to the actual fuel. After accounting for wholesale costs, transportation, state taxes, and federal taxes, a station owner might make just a few cents of pure profit per gallon of gasoline sold. They make their real profit on the items sold inside the convenience store, like coffee, candy, and hot dogs. Because their fuel margins are so incredibly tight, the primary factor determining their daily pricing is the cost to purchase their next required delivery of gasoline. Imagine you own a gas station. If global crude oil spikes today because of a war, the wholesale cost for your next fuel delivery, which is arriving on Friday, spikes simultaneously. If you continue to sell the gas currently in your tanks at last week's cheap price, you will not generate enough working capital to pay the distributor for Friday's expensive delivery. A single miscalculation here can literally bankrupt an independent station owner overnight. Therefore, future replacement costs must be factored into the pump price immediately. This forces real-time consumer price hikes despite the physical presence of older, cheaper inventory sitting underground. However, just because the local gas station owner is surviving on pennies does not mean the broader oil industry is suffering during a crisis. In fact, major oil companies and refiners employ highly specific pricing strategies to silently inflate their overall profits, particularly through the use of more expensive, higher-grade core products like premium gasoline. Gasoline is manufactured and sold to the public based on varying octane levels. A higher octane rating simply indicates the fuel is more resistant to premature combustion. It makes the fuel less prone to engine knocking, and it is frequently required for high-performance or luxury vehicle engines. Refiners have always charged a premium for this higher octane fuel. Historically, the price difference between regular unleaded and premium fuel was relatively negligible. For an entire decade, from 1995 through 2006, the gap between grades was typically just 10 cents per gallon. But in the modern era, that pricing dynamic has changed drastically. Oil companies and wholesale refiners realize that consumers who require premium fuel for their luxury cars represent a highly captive market. These drivers cannot safely downgrade to regular fuel without risking engine damage. Consequently, the price difference between the tiers has ballooned. By the year 2025, the national average price for mid-grade gasoline was roughly 57 cents higher than regular, and the average price for premium-grade gasoline was a staggering 93 cents higher per gallon than regular grade. During global supply shocks, base crude costs rise across the board. However, oil refiners frequently maintain or even actively widen these massive premium upcharges. They know that a significant portion of consumers cannot switch away from the premium product. By expanding the margin on premium and mid-grade fuels, retailers and refiners can offset the hyper-competitive, price-sensitive market for regular gasoline. This strategy allows the broader industry to quietly pad its bottom line during a crisis. The immense, overarching profitability of the petroleum sector during global disruptions is remarkably well documented. In 2022 alone, following the massive disruptions in Eastern Europe, The net income of publicly listed oil and gas companies reached an astonishing $916 billion globally. The vast majority of this unprecedented wealth was captured by the upstream crude producers and the midstream refiners, rather than the independent local retailers. Beyond the local retail pump, the very structure of how global oil is traded on international markets fundamentally shapes the ultimate price. The modern market is actually split into two distinct, highly complex arenas. This brings us to a crucial question. Do the daily oil futures reported on the evening news accurately reflect the actual prices charged when physical oil finally swaps hands? The answer is heavily dependent on the geopolitical stability of the world at any given moment. In times of relative peace and smooth supply chains, the two markets align closely, but they operate on very different fundamental rules. The futures market is a financial arena. It is dominated by paper contracts traded on highly regulated exchanges in New York and London, such as the famous ICE Brent futures contract. These contracts represent a binding agreement to buy or sell a specific amount of oil at a predetermined price at a specific date in the future. Crucially, many of these futures contracts are completely cash settled. This means that absolutely no actual barrels of oil ever change hands between the traders. At the expiration of the financial contract, a final settlement price is mathematically determined, and money is simply exchanged between the buyer and seller to settle the difference. Financial players, massive investment banks, hedge funds, and speculators use these instruments to express their market expectations and hedge their portfolios without ever having to take physical delivery of a toxic, highly flammable liquid. Nobody on a Wall Street trading floor wants 1 million barrels of crude oil dumped on their doorstep. Conversely, the physical spot market deals with the actual, logistical movement of wet barrels of oil. This physical market is anchored by entirely different benchmarks, most notably dated Brent. Dated Brent reflects the real-time price of tangible, physical crude cargoes that are scheduled to be loaded onto shipping vessels within the next 10 to 30 days. Under normal, peaceful conditions, the cash-settled financial futures market and the physical spot market move in beautiful tandem. Traders use complex arbitrage strategies to keep the paper price and the physical price tightly linked. But when a massive geopolitical crisis erupts and a supply chokepoint is severed, that historical correlation shatters completely. The financial futures market tends to look far ahead. It prices in the logical expectation that a war will eventually end, diplomats will reach an agreement, and global supply will eventually normalize. But the physical spot market does not have the luxury of looking ahead. A petroleum refinery in Japan or Germany needs actual, wet oil immediately to keep their billion-dollar machinery running today. When a massive supply bottleneck occurs, the physical spot prices violently detach from the financial futures. The actual price charged when real oil swaps hands between a producer and a desperate refiner becomes astronomically higher than the numbers flashing on financial trading screens. This mechanical disconnect between the paper market and the physical market sets the exact stage for the unprecedented, world-altering crisis of 2026. Chapter 4: Geopolitical Shocks and Supply Bottlenecks, the 2026 Iran War Scenario. The timeline reaches the present day. Following the severe structural disruptions of 2022, the global energy system remained highly sensitive, lacking the robust spare capacity of previous decades. In early 2026, the terrifying fragility of the entire international framework was exposed during the sudden outbreak of the Iran War, known widely in military and economic circles as Operation Epic Fury. This rapidly escalating conflict immediately triggered the most severe dual chokepoint shipping crisis in modern economic history. The absolute epicenter of this global disaster is the Strait of Hormuz. Located strategically between Oman and Iran, this incredibly narrow waterway connects the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the broader Arabian Sea. It is the ultimate geographic bottleneck. Prior to the outbreak of the conflict, Approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil flowed through this single strait every single day. To put that staggering number into perspective, that volume represents roughly 20% of total global petroleum consumption. Furthermore, major Gulf exporters, including heavyweights like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates, rely almost entirely on this seaborne route to reach their global customers. They possess very few practical overland pipeline alternatives that can bypass the strait. When the 2026 war escalated, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to commercial traffic. The executive director of the International Energy Agency immediately categorized the disruption as the absolute largest supply shock in the history of the global oil market. This unprecedented closure forces us to examine a critical logistical nightmare that is rarely discussed on the evening news. What exactly happens to the millions of barrels of oil that were extracted from the ground right before the conflict began? What happens to the oil that is already in the system when the exit door slams shut? The short answer is that the oil becomes entirely trapped, triggering a catastrophic logistical backlog. Oil that is extracted just before a blockade is typically pumped into massive marine tanker vessels, or it is moved into giant regional storage facilities situated along the Gulf Coast. Because the Strait of Hormuz is suddenly declared an active, high-risk war zone, international maritime insurance companies immediately drop their war risk protections for commercial vessels. Without this vital insurance, commercial shipping lines absolutely refuse to sail into the corridor. The fully loaded supertankers have no choice but to drop their anchors and sit completely motionless in the Persian Gulf. They effectively transform from transport vessels into floating, highly volatile storage tanks. The ripple effects of this trapped oil move rapidly backward up the supply chain. As the marine tankers sit idle on the water, the massive land-based storage tanks in producing countries like Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia continue to fill with newly extracted oil. Within a matter of days, these facilities rapidly approach their absolute maximum capacity. Once the regional storage tanks are completely full, the physical infrastructure hits a hard, insurmountable limit. Crude oil is a toxic, hazardous material. It cannot simply be dumped on the ground or burned off in limitless quantities. Consequently, the producing nations have no alternative whatsoever but to completely shut in their oil wells, halting the physical extraction process entirely. Millions of barrels of vital energy remain locked beneath the earth or trapped in steel hulls bobbing on the water, entirely inaccessible to a desperate global market. This massive physical bottleneck triggers the exact market dislocation we outlined in the previous era. The global oil market fractures violently into two entirely divergent realities. By March of 2026, the financial futures market remains somewhat restrained. Paper contracts trading in London and New York price Brent crude for future delivery at roughly $100 to $102 per barrel. Financial traders operate on the historical assumption that military interventions are usually short-lived, and the strait will eventually reopen. But in the physical wet barrel market, the reality is entirely different and vastly more terrifying. Refiners across Asia and Europe face an immediate, existential lack of supply. They must secure physical crude immediately to prevent their complex refining operations from shutting down, a process that costs millions to restart. Consequently, the actual spot price for real, deliverable barrels skyrockets. Dubai-linked physical crude, the essential benchmark used to price much of Asia's oil, explodes to roughly $138 to $140 per barrel. This creates a severe K-shaped economic impact. While massive financial institutions and large corporations can hedge their future costs at relatively lower paper prices, everyday households and small businesses who are dependent on physical fuel deliveries bear the catastrophic brunt of extreme, real-time energy inflation. Furthermore, the 2026 shock extends far beyond just crude oil. The Strait of Hormuz is a vital, irreplaceable artery for multiple global commodities. The conflict involves direct military strikes on critical infrastructure, including massive, targeted damage to Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial site. This single, sprawling facility is responsible for producing one-fifth of all global liquefied natural gas supplies. The military damage is severe enough to require an estimated 3 to 5 years of complex repairs, permanently removing 17% of Qatar's total export capacity from the global market for the foreseeable future. Additionally, the naval bottleneck traps massive shipments of vital agricultural fertilizers, sulfur, and raw aluminum. Because roughly 20% of the global fertilizer supply is manufactured by Persian Gulf states, the sudden inability to export these raw materials threatens worldwide agricultural yields and global food security. As fuel costs for the international shipping industry spike by 36% due to the crisis, the baseline expense of transporting all basic consumer goods increases exponentially. The global economy faces a severe, rapid deterioration, marked by sudden currency depreciations, skyrocketing consumer inflation, and a drastic reduction in manufacturing output across highly exposed regions in Asia, Europe, and Africa. In a desperate bid to ease the crisis and prevent a total global recession, government interventions shift strategy once again. Remembering the disastrous failures of the 1970s price caps and the unsustainable financial drain of the 2022 direct subsidies, the United States Treasury takes a highly targeted, almost weaponized economic approach. The government announces a temporary easing of long-standing economic sanctions on Iranian oil, issuing a narrowly tailored, short-term authorization specifically permitting the sale of Iranian oil that is currently stranded at sea. Because nations like China were already hoarding sanctioned Iranian oil on the cheap, this emergency policy shift seeks to immediately unlock an estimated 140 million barrels of trapped inventory. The strategic, geopolitical goal is brilliant in its simplicity. Flood the immediate physical market with unexpected supply, using Tehran's own stranded barrels to drive down the extreme physical spot prices and starving the regime of the price spike they desperately need. It is a modern, complex intervention for a modern, complex war. Conclusion. The evolution of global oil pricing from the mid-19th century to the catastrophic geopolitical shocks of 2026 paints a vivid, undeniable picture of a deeply interconnected, highly fragile world. The historical timeline demonstrates again and again that the physical realities of extraction, transportation, and geography consistently override financial theories and optimistic market expectations. The lessons drawn from this deep dive into history are unmistakable. When well-meaning governments attempt to artificially cap the retail price of energy, as seen during the embargoes of the 1970s, they inevitably create crippling physical shortages and widespread consumer chaos. The modern pivot toward massive financial subsidies protects the end user at the pump, but it places an enormous, potentially ruinous strain on global financial stability and national debts. At the ground level, the mechanics of the independent local petrol station reveal that the everyday consumer will always feel the sting of global volatility in near real time. This is driven by the absolute, unforgiving necessity of replacement cost pricing. Meanwhile, the major energy conglomerates and refiners consistently leverage these periods of global panic to widen their profit margins on premium products, capitalizing on captive markets. Furthermore, the aftermath of the 1990 Gulf War proves that while producing nations do not overtly charge a war reconstruction tax on crude oil, the massive loss of physical infrastructure injects a permanent, undeniable risk premium into the global market. And the recovery from these violent shocks is never symmetrical. Due to the carefully managed margins of the retail sector, prices will consistently rise like rockets at the first sign of conflict, only to float down slowly like feathers when the geopolitical terror eventually subsides. Finally, the 2026 blockade of the Strait of Hormuz serves as the ultimate culmination of all these historical vulnerabilities combined. It proves definitively that the massive financial futures market cannot accurately predict or mitigate the sudden, brutal reality of trapped physical supply. When international shipping lanes close, when insurance disappears, and when massive coastal storage tanks overflow, the entire global economy is held entirely hostage by the physical constraints of geography. Understanding these deep, historical, structural complexities is the only true way to comprehend exactly how the world works.